Hello everyone and welcome to CEDA's live stream, Return to the Office, New Norms for the Workplace. I'm Melinda Salento, the CEO of CEDA, the Committee for Economic Development of Australia, and I'm really pleased that you're joining us today for what is going to be a really interesting conversation. We're going to be talking about lots of things that I think are on all of your minds. We're going to unpack what the COVID-19 pandemic has meant for the way that we work and how people are working. Have we learned to live with COVID? How is that changing our relationships to our workplaces? How have employers dealt with the challenges of COVID and how will they in the future? Navigating regulations, shifting employee, community and government expectations, distancing, masks, workplace environments, vaccinations, boosters, the whole lot. What can we learn from other countries? Some who've taken different approaches and employers who've been trying different things to us. And perhaps to really centre our conversation, we know that when people are happy at work, their broader well-being is better as well. So these are really critically important issues for us as employers, for the economy, but also really importantly for all of our workers and us as individuals. So suffice to say, certainly very rich terrain for us to traverse over the next hour. Before we get into that conversation, can I, of course, start by acknowledging that today, as always, we meet here in Australia on Aboriginal land. I'm joining you from the land of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nations, and I would like to pay my respects to elders past, present, and importantly, emerging elders in the spirit of reconciliation. We're committed to building better relationships and understanding here at CEDA, and one of the things that we're doing to actually lift our involvement is developing a reconciliation action plan. We've already looked at how we can give greater voice to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people and their aspirations. And hopefully through our own reconciliation action plan, we'll be able to further that. Now, before we jump into our discussions, I would also, of course, like to thank and acknowledge today's live stream sponsor, LHH. Conversations and discussions like this are as important as ever, and we can't facilitate them, we can't put them on for you without the support of our members and sponsors. So a big call out and thanks to LHH. As always, for those of you who are familiar with CEDA live stream events, you can interact and contribute to the conversation through our question and answer portal, which is available via the link on your screen. Or you can enter the details by going to ceda.pigeonhole.at in your browser and using the passcode OFFICE. Once you're there, you can post your questions, you can vote on questions that others have asked, and you can also give us your opinions through the poll question which we've posed. How optimistic are you that an office work from home hybrid model will be beneficial to the workforce? Now, let's get started. Let me introduce you to our panellists and get going. We've got Dr. Sean Gallagher, who is the Director for the Centre for the New Workforce at the Swinburne University of Technology. Dr. Ben Hamer, Future of Work Lead for PwC Australia. Dr. Karina Powers, who is an occupational and environmental physician and executive, a member of AusSage. And JC Townsend, Chief Executive Officer, UK and Ireland for LHH. Welcome, everyone. A little bit of an acknowledgement that we've got all ends of our day here, with Karina coming in from Perth and JC coming in from London. So a special thanks to those of you who've woken up early and are staying up late. Now, let's jump into our conversation. Karina, To say that we've been on a COVID roller coaster, I think, is an understatement. I know when I got to the end of 2020, I was sort of somewhat naively thinking about post-pandemic, and I know that's some of the language that people were using. Here we are now. I think we've learned we're still not post-pandemic, but what have we learned about how we should be thinking about COVID and what employers need to be thinking about now as we go through this, this Omicron wave of COVID?
So firstly, the most useful construct to think about this is as an epidemic disease that comes in waves. We can do something to flatten those waves down. So for instance, we're not out of the woods yet. In the last fortnight before Monday, we had about over 400,000 cases approximately. Obviously, we don't have a really good handle on it with the current testing. It's a bit tricky, but this wave is still rolling and is likely to be amplified further when the schools are all back and reopened. You do not want part of this wave to occur in your own office or to have your own mini wave. And the idea that we are all going to get this is particularly fatalistic and not helpful. So there are very much practical things we can all do to stop outbreaks occurring in our workplaces. And it takes a little bit of effort, but if you apply yourself, you're really going to save your workforce from direct and indirect losses, and you're going to prevent the suffering in the community, and you will basically build your reputation as being a safe and trusted organisation for doing the right thing. We need to really concentrate on having safe indoor air ventilation. And obviously there are ways to assess that. Ideally, you would CO2 monitor and check that your CO2 levels in the areas where you have employees working or in shared spaces or in bathrooms or kitchens is under 800 parts per million. But if you cannot access a CO2 monitor in urgent circumstances, then you can do simple things like cross-ventilate with open doors and windows and also look at your mechanical ventilation, perhaps with the help of your HVAC engineer, and also just think about whether you have any employees who must be in the office in respirators. They're about 2.5 times better at preventing infection than masks. And you may not have time to fit test people and things like that. So you do need to just think about just provision of these respirators, which are a high quality mask. They're more technologically advanced than a straight mask. You must encourage people to get vaccinated their 3rd dose. That cuts down the hospitalisation rate considerably. And look at having rapid antigen test programs if it's practical for you. It is a program. One-off is not going to be enough. And then look at your actual administrative things, such as having people work from home with some education around that, because you don't want to lose your employees from their lifestyle with not wearing respirators in indoor spaces or in close proximity outside either. So there's some basic things that organisations can do to cut the loss to their workforce.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, it's fascinating to me just how quickly some of these things have evolved as well in terms of rapid antigen testing, which is great to see. But I guess the takeout from you is that the things that we've seen that have made employers trusted already in terms of how they're thinking about their staff and how they're looking after their staff, work from home, distancing, good ventilation, and the provision of PPE and testing is going to be par for the course for some time yet, I think is what I'm hearing from you. We'll come back. I've got a few more questions, and I'm sure there's going to be some other questions from people who are looking for a bit more advice on this. But Sean, let me bring you into the conversation. Early on, I mean, I think we've kind of gone through these waves of thinking as the waves of the virus have come through. And at the beginning, when we were all working from home, there was this immediate sort of jump to, oh, this is the new way of working. And I have to be honest and say I sort of questioned whether it was going to stick. 2 years in, I think it's going to stick. What do you think? And what are employers thinking about in terms of how they're thinking about workplaces, work from home, and the new way of work?
Thanks very much, Melinda, and it's great to be with you here this morning. We've recently done some research to really understand how all the various components of flexible working are actually working. So, those workers who are working from home, those who are in the office, and those who are flexibly in between. And, what is probably a headline that everyone has seen is that there's a huge expectation on flexible working. And more than 75% of knowledge workers, so white collar workers, want flexibility in the way that they work. So some time at home and some time in the office. There's quite a very few, like 10%, only want to be at home. So there's a huge expectation to, once it's safe to come back into the workplace, that we're able to. The reason is that workers love the work-life balance, but our research has shown that flexible working isn't actually working all that well. These workers who are flexibly, so going between sites, not at a fixed location, they were least productive, they were least able to collaborate with their team, they were least able to take a break when needed, and they felt least connected to their organization. And compared to workers of fixed location, what we think is happening is that flexible working is a little bit too complicated. Because workers are trying to figure out, what am I going to do? Where am I going to do it? Who am I going to do it with across different sites? So it's a challenging logistical problem for workers that they're having to solve. So we think that given the huge expectations on flexible working, more than 2 in 5 workers are prepared to walk in search of a flexible working job, that we need to reimagine our approach to hybrid. So rather than hybrid just focusing on solving the logistical challenges of the where and when, we think that there's great evidence that's coming out now to take a different look at the value of the location. We've had 2 years of working from home, and what it's done is it's helped us understand, actually, some of the work we used to do in the office shouldn't actually be done in the office. Individual productivity, task-based routine, even team meetings when you're sharing information. All of that stuff is actually better done out of the office. And there's research out of the US to show that there could be even a 5% productivity increase for individuals and the organizations if that work is done remotely. So that sort of brings the question, well, what's the comparative advantage of the office? And our research shows it's really about bringing together for meaningful human interaction. So relationship forming, ideation, creativity, complex problem solving. So really, when you come bringing people together for where a complex transfer of information and converging on meaning is required, and that's absolutely best done in person. So in terms of a restructure of hybrid, to actually start to think about the comparative location of work, and so that it's actually better to carve out that repetitive routine work out of the office and put it into the home, but to repurpose and reframe and reset our mindsets about the office. And in this way, we think that flexible working will become simpler and therefore more attractive to workers, but at the same time drive productivity and innovation outcomes for organizations.
Yeah, thanks, Sean. I'm quickly taking notes because there's an awful lot in there, and I think there's a lot to unpack around what businesses and employers should be thinking about, and then the how piece. And I'm a bit interested in whether we get better at this as time goes on, but I'll come back to you. JC, in some ways, one of the things that we like to do in Australia, and everyone's been doing around the world, is to look at how others have been managing through this pandemic. You're over there in the UK. The UK embraced an approach that was more open than us at different stages and earlier. What have you seen from employers in the UK that you think we might learn from in terms of how they're managing this flexibility, either good or bad?
Yeah, sure. Well, I can talk about 2 things. I think one, you have distributed a report, Resetting Normal, which really talks about leadership and people attitudes to return to the workplace that we did last year. The second thing is in the UK, we work with more than 1,000 corporate clients, some of the biggest companies in the country. And that gives us a real close view into their workforces and their workforce strategies and how those strategies are hitting on the ground. So if I were going to think back and think of, the middle of last summer, it was July for us. There was a huge amount of optimism, right? Just like you, Melinda, at the end of last year, you thought, okay, we're through this, right? I mean, that vaccines were taking off, high demand in the UK, and a really fast rollout for the vaccines. It was the middle of summer, case rates were down, death rates were really on the floor. It was amazing. And already businesses were thinking about, great, how do we get back? How do we get back to the office? How do we get back to normal? So along the lines of what Dr. Powers said, the first thing was thinking about how to keep people safe when we came back into the office. Now, ventilation, it's interesting. We didn't hear that much about ventilation here, but of course, that's like a critical thing that businesses need to be thinking about. A lot in London, a lot of the office windows don't open, so you need to work with your HVAC systems in your building to fix that. But what was really clear was very strict social distancing. So going into the offices, taking out seats, crossing seats over with tape so that people couldn't sit next to each other. Very strict rules about when people were in the office, they had their masks on. Especially anytime they were walking around. Sometimes when they were at their desks, they could take masks off. Very strict hygiene protocols about, using hand sanitizer, not even serving drinks, coffee in the office in the beginning, so that you could just keep everything as sanitary as possible. And interestingly, what the first thing people noticed was they actually felt less connected at work because they were wearing masks than they felt when they were online and they could actually see people's faces and expressions. So that was an issue. A lot of testing. So there was a lot of, ideas of getting back to work safely, but the real hope of really getting everyone back to work. And some businesses were extremely strict, especially in some of our financial services clients. We're getting the top-down command from the CEO, everyone back to the office now. And really finding a way to find a seat for everyone in the office when you were trying to maintain the social distancing. Well, that only lasted about 3 or 4 months till we hit our autumn. And then first the Delta variant hit, and then the Omicron variant hit. And suddenly caseloads were skyrocketing. And, sadly, while the death rates weren't as severe, certainly going up again. And the country had to go back into a lockdown. And so where it went from an attitude of July of businesses thinking, okay, this was a blip. We all learned how to work remotely, which is a great enhancement to our digital capabilities, but we're back to normal. I think by October, November this year, there was a real understanding of, we're never going to get back to where we were. And businesses started to rethink, what does that really mean? What does that, how do we make this work? And like you have in Australia and the UK, we had very high demand for labor, very low supply. And so it really became an employee's market in terms of being able to dictate what they wanted to do. And a lot of employees wanted to start to have more flexible work environments. So that led to this trend of businesses saying, okay, we'll just be open and let people do what they want. But then they found that didn't really work either because, having kind of a do whatever you like attitude towards hybrid working doesn't work. So what we found is that being in the office wasn't that helpful in itself unless your other teammates were in the office with you. So we had to start to be deliberate about managers directing people when to be in the office and being in the office together so that those collaborations could take place. We also found companies had to be deliberate in their policy so that it wasn't individual managers making decisions that I don't know so much in Australia, but here in the UK, we've got the full spectrum of opinions of everyone back in the office, I don't even trust that you're working unless I can see you, to everyone can be flexible. And you really needed some top-down strategies from the company to help guide managers through that, and some training for managers on how to manage in a hybrid workforce. And then the last thing before I'll move on to the rest of you, and we can go to questions later, is I think one of the really key lessons we learned is, COVID and our attitudes toward it are extremely divisive. And we have to be careful that the mechanisms we implement don't further create divisions among our people. And so we found companies that survived better were ones that created a top-down consistent policy that was more biased towards protection and the health and safety of their people, even if it was a little bit more strict than the government required and even a little bit more strict than everyone had tolerance for. And then, but a real sense of they were protecting the health of their people and take away some of the individual decision making. So some companies, created lanyards that said, do you want to be hugged or do you want a social distance? And that some companies had a lot of success with that. Some companies found that was extremely divisive to actually put almost a political label on someone about how they felt about COVID. So we found consistent processes and policies coming top down, more biased towards the safety end than the freedom end. I think has worked the best so far.
Thanks for that, JC. And there's a couple of really interesting things that I think we can unpack with the rest of the panel. This point about around training, I think we'll come back to that with Sean in particular, because I think that's so much about the how. And as he was talking about logistics and the complexity of things, I think that's something for people themselves. Obviously, they're grappling with and to manage, but there is a big question, I think, around what that means for managers and how we think about the training that they require. But also, I think that interesting point about, top-down bias towards health and safety, I actually think that's one of the things that we're all really grappling with at the moment, because it's been 2 years. Governments are backing away from some of the more stringent regulations and requirements themselves. And I actually think that's a really interesting challenge for employers, because now you've got to make the decisions, and it's a much more complex landscape. And I think in some ways, having that clarity is almost a bit harder now than it was when there was so much uncertainty about the pandemic itself or the virus itself. So let's come back to that. Ben, you've been on the bench. We've got to get you in here, get you in the game. You've done a lot of work around where the employee is at the moment and what their expectations are. We had a live stream earlier on this week that was around the Great Resignation. That got talked about a lot there, so I don't really want to talk about it so much, except to ask you this question. Sitting in that phrase is an implication that the balance of power has really shifted to employees. Is that the case? And from your perspective, and how are employees wanting to leverage that newfound balance of power from the perspective of your work?
Yeah, it's a good question. Look, there's a lot of debate on the Great Resignation and whether or not it's happening and how great is great. But I think we need to actually look at the phenomenon that sits behind it. And in terms of the market context, we have a record number of job vacancies at the moment. You have Seek, who's out in market reporting that there's a 50% increase in job advertisements since before the pandemic, as well as a lot less people applying for the jobs that are on offer now. So that tells us that there's a lot of opportunity, and this is a really good story for workers. And because of that, the balance of power has shifted from the employer to the employee. Now, in terms of the forward outlook, we did some research where we found that 38% of Australians said that they're thinking about leaving their employer this year. So not just changing jobs, which can be internal, but leaving their employer altogether. And 38%, that's just an intention. It's not an actual, so it's not going to be that high. And we're not comparable to the US, who are projected to exceed turnover of 40% based on their actual data. But the reality in all of this is that turnover is increasing in Australia. Workers are using the current market to seek better conditions, get better pay, and they're leaving organisations where they may feel burnt out, overworked, or undervalued. And so while we can try and debate the name of the Great Resignation, I think to try and downplay a phenomenon of people leaving organisations at above average rates is just looking for an excuse for lazy management, to be honest. So for employers, they need to really be looking at their employee value proposition. How do they go attract and retain talent in the market? And when we asked top executives in Australia, so CEOs and direct reports, 49% in Australia told us they have no intention whatsoever of looking at their EVP. So that's a massive red flag, and hopefully the dial has shifted a little bit since then with Omicron. But for workers, the research is pretty clear in showing us that they want three key things from organisations. They want work-life balance, they want to be paid fairly for the work that they do, and above anything else, they just want to work with good people.
Well, I'm concerned by the proportion that aren't looking at their EVP. It's been top of the pops for us, I can tell you. I'm going to come back on this work-life balance question straight out of the gate, because the question that we're getting from the audience that's just gone right to the top of the poll, if you like, in support from others, is essentially goes to that. And I think we sometimes conflate flexibility with balance. And yet one of the sort of anecdotes, if you like, that's come through from the pandemic is that people haven't achieved that balance at home. And if anything, that balance has worsened because the lines between work and home have blurred. So I'm really interested in the perspectives of Sean, Ben and JC actually around how you're seeing that. You know, Sean, you talked about the challenge of complexity of logistics. You know, how can we assist our employees in getting better at that? But first, you know, is this an issue, and how is it being managed? I might go first to you, Ben, if you don't mind.
Yeah, sure. So it's a really great point, and absolutely agree the boundaries between work and home are completely blurred. So it makes it increasingly complex. I think previously organisations felt that the moment an employee walked out of the front door of the office building, that the duty of care all of a sudden stopped. I can see my dog is now come in the blurred background. So it's really important now to rethink the game we're playing in at the moment. So what we know is that 85% of Australians reported having mental health challenges throughout the pandemic, and over half of Australians said that they have found it really difficult to try and balance work and home commitments. And that's particularly felt by female workers as well, who traditionally, take on some of the additional caring commitments more than males. So that's something that we need to be thinking about in terms of the employer perspective around what should you be doing about it. It's really important to think about what a 24/7 digital wellbeing offering looks like. We know that employees are expecting that from their employers. We know that a lot of workers actually see their employer as the primary source of accessing mental health and wellbeing support services. And the time of day that they're actually looking for that support is 9 p.m. at night. So for an organisation to have an EAP program where people can access it from 9 to 5 isn't relevant or realistic anymore. It needs to be much more than just that. And I'm sure Karina has some perspectives on that as well, but we need to be thinking about what a 24/7 digital offering looks like. And we need to be thinking about how we can support, to JC's point earlier, managers in particular, for how they can try and manage workload, wellbeing, and team dynamics within that context.
JC, similar sort of experience in the UK, I'm guessing?
Yeah, I think one of the things we found in the first year of the pandemic is that the loss of commuting time did not translate into less work time. Actually, the commuting time turned directly into extra work. And I think, coping with the pandemic and the hybrid working and everything actually required that much more work. And so we kept some of the productivity up, but on the backs of the workers. In terms of now, however, that should be lessening, right? We're returning more to like a normal work environment. And yet we're not finding that we're improving on the work-life balance. And I think there's two reasons in the UK. The biggest reason is childcare duties. So, the kids are back at school, but the rules are, there's lots of exposure to COVID. Right now in the UK, 1 in 15 people has COVID. And that creates a lot of kids out of school, a lot of kids that have to be supported by their parents in remote learning, et cetera. That makes it a very tough work day when you're trying to accomplish your work and take care of your kids and making sure that they're successful in their learning as well. And this is no longer a short-term thing, right? It's not a 1 or 2 weeks. It's actually years of education that parents are taking on a stronger role than they have had. The second thing that I was going to say about the work-life balance is that we've become much more efficient in Zoom calls, but we find that actually the technology is creating an extra stressor on workers. So we have to help educate our workers on being very deliberate about how they use video conferencing and technology so that they don't create those mental stresses. So now that people are going back into the office, they say, oh, I actually get a break in between meetings as opposed to just a click and then you're right on to the next meeting. And a lot of the best companies are introducing really, formal training programs for employees on how to have a healthy digital experience when a lot of your work is online.
Yeah, thanks, JC. Sean, I'm going to come back to you just in a minute around, because we're going to flip this and look positively around the whole sort of productivity question. And so I've got a question for you, but I did want to bring Karina in around the sort of the EAP sort of mental health piece, but also just pick up on a question here, which is also attracting a lot of votes, I think really resonating, which is language is actually around a collective kind of post-traumatic stress kind of disorder around from COVID, mental health. And one of the things that we were talking about prior to going live was the fact that there's a sort of generalisation around workforces. And we're talking about workforces really that are capable of working from home when there's been a really big workforce that hasn't been able to work from home. And actually they really have been under enormous stress. So how should we be thinking about that, do you think, Karina?
Well, I think from what I've been hearing from workers, there's a lack of trust when management doesn't do the right scientific things that they are well aware of from the state of knowledge of their reading that need to be done. And so that involves basically making sure that it's clear that your ventilation has been properly checked and dealt with. And if they must come into the office during a wave, that they do have the right sort of protections in place, including access to decent quality masks, respirators, or how to adjust those. So there's a whole lot of learning that you can find in www.odsage.org on all these sort of matters about controls. So incredibly important, because the workers are telling me that management is saying these things, we must come back to the office, and yet we all know that it's not safe. So it starts to play with their mind, and I think it's a real struggle if businesses and organisations and government doesn't control the caseload, because as JC was saying, you start to get the indirect problems where children are off sick, or your workers are getting stressed because other workers are off sick, and it can hit young workers very hard. I mean, half of the caseload in the past fortnight was under 30s, and just because they're vaccinated, it doesn't mean that in the realms of Omicron that they don't get symptomatic and do feel quite unwell. They may not be hospitalised. They may not be in a hospital in the home program, but they can feel very unwell. To do with the employee assistance providers, yes, they're incredibly valuable, and they do need to be scheduled at a real time that workers will use them. And also ones that have access to a clinical psychologist, a more highly trained psychologist, is important, I find, as an occupational physician, because some of the patients really are quite unwell, and they need that sort of higher level of expertise to hopefully turn them around from a more serious illness and keep your worker at work functioning. Thanks.
Thanks, Karina. Now, I'm just going to pause here and tell people that I've just got this screen that's just got a truckload of questions, so I'm going to do my best to manage them. I'm going to knock one on the head straight away or get it out of the way. A few questions in here about research, and can people talk about a bit more of the research they've done. We will make sure that there's links or viewers are aware of the research that speakers have done, so you can have access to that. And we'll plough through some more questions, but we'll make sure that the work that's been done, that our speakers are referencing, that you get access to that where possible. So, Sean, I think nested in a whole bunch of this is this question about, we know that we're going to have a more flexible kind of work setup. We know we're going to have some people in the office some days, some people at home. What do businesses need to be doing? How can they implement this in a way that reflects the needs and well-being of their employees, but also actually delivers the sort of productivity and collaboration that we need, and not false productivity in terms of people working until midnight?
Thanks. That's a very important question for organisations all the way across the country. And I pick up on Karina's word of waves. Depending on where you live, Sydney or Melbourne, we've had at least one, if not two waves of returning to the office. And for the most part, they've been pretty dismal. Workers, even when we were able to come back in the office, we haven't. And I think what JC mentioned in terms about purposeful collaboration, and certainly Ben in terms of work-life balance, that this is part of the mindset that we need to shift about the purpose of the office. I think that any work employer that wants their workers to come back in to sit at a terminal and process email should be shamed, because really that is not going to be the purpose of the office. And workers haven't come back into the office to do that. So some of the things and we need to begin reframing in a way that's not going to be completely disruptive overnight. So identifying some low-hanging fruits about the type of activities that should occur in the office versus home. Of course, this is in COVID-safe type arrangements. So thinking of rituals that only occur in the office. So bringing in your team, or even bringing members from across the organization, remembering that a lot of the connections across the organization have decayed, and they're absolutely essential for complex problem solving and dealing with major issues. But, starting a certain morning of the week with a brainstorming session, or bringing in workers once a quarter for a what went wrong session. So really starting to use the space in a completely different way as to the type of work that they did, and to get some successes on the board about reframing what the new office actually is. But at the same time, from a worker's perspective, I think it's not just work-life balance, but it's also a balance within work. And making sure that there's absolutely a lot of data on meeting overload, collaboration overload, that organizations are very strict at making sure that deep thinking time is protected, that workers are able to take a break throughout the day and for their restorative purposes, and a number of other factors that I'm happy to talk about. But I think we need to start identifying some low-hanging fruits that are going to be success stories that show that hybrid can work, that show that the office can work, and then, and experiment with that for 6 months, to do it, to co-design what the rituals of the new office are with your employees, and to co-design with your employees what does work balance look like, and to see how that goes for 6 months, and then to figure out what works and what are new things that we want to try.
All right, Ben, I'm going to bring you in on this because I know you've done a bunch of stuff on leadership. I've got so many questions that have just unfolded from what Sean has said and some stuff that JC said earlier. And let me try to paraphrase it. On the one hand, you've got employees who've got more power, if you like. They're looking for a new value proposition from their employers. I think I've heard from JC that in some ways slightly more directive management has worked. One of the questions here is sort of raising this issue of micromanagement, which has definitely been found out through this crisis. But everything that Sean's just said, to me, let's pick up the things that I think make that successful. Two-way communication, empowering management, and this kind of interesting balance of we all need you in the office on this day doing these activities. Is Australian management up for this? And I mean, how are they going to do this? I mean, can they do this? And what's your thinking on that?
Yeah, so look, I think this exposed something that's happened in organisations for a long time, which is that we invest a hell of a lot of money in graduate development, a hell of a lot of money in senior executive leadership. And then there's this middle layer that we just assume once they go from being a technical expert to a middle manager, they'll just learn it on the job and figure out how to be a manager. And what's happening now is the complexity of the environment that they're dealing with and everything we're talking about with remote working and shifts to new ways of working, it all comes back down to the middle manager and how they manage and lead their teams. And so we've underinvested for a long time. Organizations really need to step up in understanding that complexity and providing that required level of capability uplift for managers. Because what we're also seeing, a lot of the perverse behaviors, whether it's around, I think Karina mentioned it as well, which is I'm the manager, so you can all come into the office on the days that suit me and my lifestyle as the person that makes the decision. Or individuals who, may not be on top of what their individual's personal circumstances are, or the cost of coordinations. When we talk about workload increasing, a lot of it is just trying to stay on top of what everyone's doing because you can't physically see them. I think there's a mindset shift that underpins this that needs to happen, which is you can't just take what happened in a 5-day-a-week office face-to-face environment, plonk that online and assume that it's going to work just as well. And you can't compensate by continually picking up the phone or getting on chat to say, hey, are you working? What are you working on? Tell me where this is at. So it comes back to that thing we've been talking about as well, which is around trust. How do you trust your employees? I assume that organizations have gone through a recruitment process where they've hired fully formed adults, so you should be treating them like that as well. And when people say that working from home is not working because people aren't being productive or they're not performing, that's a performance management issue. That's not a work from home issue. And so again, it comes back to looking for excuses for lazy management. So I think that in terms of your question, are Australian managers ready for this? They don't have a choice. I think we need them to be. They have to be. But let's recognise that they haven't been supported by their organisations up until now to really rise to the challenge. And so we need to be seeing that level of investment coming through.
Yeah, thanks, Ben. I think that's a really good point. And the pandemic, I think, has exposed this. But to be honest, I think it's been one of the things that's lurked behind some of the challenges around diversity and inclusion more broadly. Managing flexibility and managing different workers rather than assuming that everyone works the same way and can be kind of managed in the same way. I did have a question for JC. I'm going to come back here, but Ben, you've sort of touched on something that is running some votes here in the questions as well, which is around the approach in the US, which is seeing more intrusive surveillance of workers to sort of get around this so-called hours theft or people being lazy and not working. I kind of thought that the pandemic debunked that because that was such a barrier to work from home and all of a sudden we just had to. Are you seeing conversations around this sort of trust for surveillance playing out in Australia? I mean, I'm hearing from you that that's just lazy management, but anything else to add in specifically in respect of what we're seeing in other countries?
Yeah, I mean, I think that what you're saying in the US is entirely right. And globally, I think there was something that came out that in the first year of COVID and therefore the shift to remote working, the number one software that sold was productivity software, which is just a fancy title for surveillance software. And so what we're seeing in Australia, not as much of that to the same extent. But again, it comes back, as I said, around how we try and build trust with our teams. I think we need to shift the conversation away from productivity, which should hopefully help in all of this as well. Productivity is output over time. So it works in a factory or when you're manufacturing, you're building things and how many things did you build in an hour. But as knowledge workers, who are predominantly the people working from home, you can't be talking about productivity. You need to be talking about effectiveness. You need to be talking about impact. And so I think we need to shift the conversation, and that will partly help with that. And again, micromanagement and this surveillance that's coming through is coming through from a lack of trust, a lack of capability from those individuals in terms of exposing their flaws in management capability as well.
Sean, you want to jump in on this?
Yeah, just a quick one. There was a case study done on a software company in the US that had this productivity software. They found that individual workers, their productivity levels went through the roof because they were producing many more lines of code. But the overall product releases of the company went down. And that was because the organization didn't actually focus on connecting people from across the organization to pull together different expertise in order to prototype and release new products.
Yeah, I mean, I think the issue that has been on my mind is, I think, something you touched on earlier, Sean, which is just how you get that sort of collaboration and innovation. And it's just, I think the longer this has gone on and the more we've sort of, I mean, you get into the office and then you're back home, and kind of getting the right balance there and getting people, I mean, we've had a lot of conversations about how you create white space and you get that space for genuine creativity and big thinking, which it seems to be harder to achieve at the moment. And I think it's a combination of uncertainty, but also the logistics and everything else. Daisy, one of the questions that's come through for you is around this piece around, inclusion, and some things that were done to try to help people understand their colleagues, perhaps a little bit simplistic in terms of lanyards and the like. But, one of the things sitting beneath all of this, and we sort of touched on it a little bit already, is there are lots of different groups, and I think there's a bit of a risk that we're sort of thinking about them generically. So there's people who haven't been able to work from home. There's people whose work from home environment has not been ideal, and a lot of talk about, it's the younger generation that really wants to be back in the office and engaging and all the rest of it. What have you seen play out in the UK, or, what's your thoughts or advice around thinking about these different groups, how you create a more inclusive approach that cuts across all of those different attributes?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. I think there's been a lot of work on it. I don't know how much success we've had. I think, when you, so there's several different things about inclusion. So one thing is this issue of people having different attitudes about COVID and their experiences and their level of fear and their level of, bravado. And I think it's really important that we kind of depoliticize those kind of discussions and we kind of honor people's own experience, because it's all over the map, and it's a huge mental health issue, I think, for every person that this touches, and we just need to be aware of it and be accepting of it. And I think it's really important that leaders try really hard to be open to the variety of perspectives when they're leading their businesses through this. But one interesting thing, as we were talking about trust, and this goes a little bit to the inclusivity, is I think we have to be honest that not everyone can work from home productively. And I think there are, there's a whole category, or there's whole groups of workers who find it very difficult to kind of self-motivate themselves when they're not in an office environment. And that's not about trust or the manager doesn't trust them. It's about that the manager or the business isn't giving them the right kind of supports when they're home alone without monitoring to really be productive. And so those are the kinds of places I think where managers have to be trained, and they have to be very deliberate about how do you bring people together. Monitoring doesn't necessarily work. There's an article in the Guardian of this, IT guy who was bragging about how he worked a 2-hour day and he just set his computer up to hit all the KPIs that were being monitored on him. And, which I thought was a terrible article. But, it's like those things, as I think Sean was saying, that's not productivity, that's not outcome. And so really being deliberate about how you bring people together. But then the last thing on inclusivity is there's a real worry about, as we go into hybrid choices, and if we might end up with very kind of perverse outcomes depending on who is choosing to work from home and who's choosing to come into the office. We have to be really careful about proximity bias, and because you're seeing someone and you're seeing someone over the water cooler or going to lunch with them, that you are more connected with them than you are with your hybrid workers. And there's a real concern in the UK that the vast burden of childcare tends to fall on women, and they're starting to worry and feel that women are actually taking steps backwards because they're more likely to be working from home and therefore out of those live connections in the office. And so that's a real problem that we have to solve for.
Yeah, thanks, Ben.
Yeah, I just also agree completely with everything JC said. I guess some positives around it from an inclusion perspective as well. So what the research is showing is that working from home is really leveling the playing field. So it's no longer about the loudest person in the room, but we all occupy the same real estate on a call, and you've got introverted people who feel more confident to contribute because they can use a raise hand feature or they can type in the chat. Atlassian did some research where they found that over 40% of females said they feel more empowered to contribute and to perform remotely as well. And then also junior workers, we've got all these digital natives who I call the Fortnite generation who are coming through, and they're feeling like they can perform and contribute more as well by leveraging the technology that's available to them. And so notwithstanding that not everyone is able to work from home, and totally agree around proximity bias as we return to the workplace, there are some real benefits from an inclusion perspective if we frame it properly.
Yeah, thanks, Ben. I just want to acknowledge that the number one question here now on my list is around vaccination registers. And I just want to say, I'm not sure we're going to get, with 7 minutes to go, we're going to get to the right place for that with this set of panellists for the audience, unless someone wants to jump in and give me the definitive response on vaccine registers. But can I just say, I'll talk to the team and see if we can somehow get some information together that will respond to that question in a way that you might find useful. So I'm sorry about that, but I'm just going to park that question. We've got 7 minutes. I've got 3 more questions I'm really hoping to unpack with this group. Hopefully maybe a quick one for you, Karina, and then slightly meatier one on EVP in office. But Karina, one of the questions that's come through is around the number of cases that are being reported at the moment, and what is there a number at which point we sort of think it's safe to go back into offices, or where we're expecting more people to be regularly going back into the offices? Have you got a kind of a line of sight to that, or some advice?
Well, my advice would be, yes, do keep an eye on what's happening with case numbers. But of course, we don't really have a good handle on them. We don't have the adequate testing. There's some barriers to that. But also that the hospitalizations are helpful to watch as well. But again, they miss a lot of cases as well. So I think you just have to multiply everything by some larger factor in your brain when you're looking at this. Some workers, of course, must come into the office. There's no choice. They're in some way, they are critical with some tasks that they have to do. And in that case, the best thing you can do is have all those controls in place. Every element of those, every rung of that hierarchy of controls is important. In ventilation, if you really do have some dead spaces there, we call them, then the HEPA filters, I've seen some misinformation put out by managers, which is tragic. The HEPA filters do clear virus from the air. They're not the be all and end all, but they are another level of control that should be there. So I think it's there when the wave is obviously past and the risk is low. It's the ones who were working from home that you want to have back in the office for good reasons. They can come back, but it needs to be safe. You need to have put in your levels of controls, and it is doable. And if you're not sure how to do them or what is important, please look at our Osage documents, get some advice, use your occupational physicians and hygienists. We're critical.
No, that's the answer, isn't it? Go to the experts. JC, you wanted to just jump in on that one?
Yeah, I was just going to say I hadn't, followed on for where the state is in the UK, and I thought I would tell you. So back in July, it was all social distancing. Then it was back to workers working from home if they can. The government has just moved to actually back to the office, and now there will be no social distancing, no masks. And even next month, the English government is saying that if you have COVID, you don't even have to isolate. So we're now at the point in the UK where they're truly treating COVID like an endemic, something that's always there, and people use their own best judgment. And I think that's going to create a whole new way of thinking about just how do we deal with hybrid working, and what's the right way to kind of protect people and protect their mental health when people have different levels of comfort with that. So just to bring you up to speed with where the UK is going. So
we will watch that, not just in one season either. We'll see how that plays out in other seasons. Sean, question I think that fits for you. A lot of interest in, we've talked about sort of logistics and processes. Any thoughts on what the office of the future will look like? You know, how we think about built environment, apart from obviously having fantastic ventilation?
I think many organizations, particularly, they're thinking of, do we downsize? Do we keep the same floor plate? Do we get rid of the office completely? I'd certainly advise against not having some space somewhere. I understand that many organizations have gone completely remote, but I would absolutely recommend that they bring their teams together and across the organization for some periods throughout the year. Just on a pure numbers. So the typical office space, and there's this is very generalized. Around about 80% of office space was dedicated to individual workstations, and that's how the developers, the builders, and architects actually measure the productivity of floor. How many people can we jam in per square meter, kind of thing, and 80% for individual workplaces and about 14% collaborative. In the with a partner we're working with, Hayworth, the numbers that they're now looking at is around, so collaborative space has gone up to about 40%, and individual task-based spaces have come down to about just under 50%, so almost even. And clearly, you do need to have some task-based opportunities for workers. Some people just can't work at home. But you can see the huge shift towards collaborative space. But what we talk about, it's more than just the space. And it's more than just having an office approach. Organizations that do a set and forget are going to fail, because just one quick example, Salesforce, they spent a lot of money in collaborative spaces, and then they watched how the workers used it. They found that workers would go in with their laptop and be an individual and not use the space for the collaborative purposes. So having rituals and behaviors that are actually fit for purpose, and the organizations need to curate and program and be purposeful and managing and making sure that we begin to change our view and mindset and of what the office actually is, and start to reframe our view on that. Thanks,
Sean. I'm really reminded that just before the pandemic, I sat down with a bunch of CFOs who were talking about how they'd sold out of all their CBD office space, and then all thinking that people all wanted to work from home, and then all of a sudden they created these really funky workplaces, and then everyone wanted to be back and they were looking for more space. So this is ebb and flow. All right, Ben, I'm giving you a challenge, 60 seconds or less. What does an EVP look like now?
Wow, okay, 60 seconds or less. So I think what we need to think about is hyper-personalization. So similar to consumer products, employees want a personalized EVP. So think about health insurance extras. How can you pick and choose what you want to use, what you don't want to use? So thinking about how you give people allowances rather than set parameters around what they have to use for different bits and pieces. Coming back to what I said earlier, the top things that workers want, irrespective of demographic, is around pay, working with good people, and work-life balance. So remuneration and wellbeing really feature right up there in terms of an EVP. But then also think about the kind of workforce demographic you have or want to attract, and then think about how you can skew it more towards their preferences as well. And you said, Melinda, that you'll share some resources, and I'll give the research around what workers want and the factors within an EVP, but which also shows what women may want more than men, country workers over city workers, et cetera. So you can get some evidence around where you might want to focus.
Yeah, that's great. And thank you so much. I'm sorry to put you under the pump like that, but one of the things that I think is really coming out of the questions is that people are really looking for facts and evidence. Great thing that's come out of the pandemic is that experts are back back on the top of the popularity list. But yeah, they're really looking for some help and some evidence and some data to help them take ideas through their organisation as well credibly. So we'll make sure that we get that stuff out to the audience as best we can. I knew this hour was going to absolutely fly by, and it has. We could have gone on for ages. Let me thank our panelists, Sean, Karina, Ben, and JC. Thanks also, of course, to our sponsors, LHH. They've really been behind us on these really important workplace conversations, which obviously there is a huge appetite for here in Australia. Let's quickly go to the poll. Fortunately for me, it is definitive. This is an optimistic audience. You are very optimistic that Office plus work from home hybrid models, I like to call them work from anywhere models, are going to be beneficial. Bit of a caveat for me, I think what we're hearing from everyone is that it's not going to be beneficial without some serious investment and rethinking the way we work, how we communicate with our employees, and what we offer them. So fantastic conversation. Thank you so much for being here. As always, CEDA's got a fully packed program coming to you in the weeks and months ahead. I'd love to put a bit of a plug in for our flagship Economic and Political Outlook. Information on all of our events is available at our website, ceda.com.au. So jump on there, register, and I really look forward to seeing you soon on another live stream and hopefully also at a face-to-face event soon. Thanks, everyone. Have a great day.